been really an interesting experience, I would say. All the speakers really presented interesting contributions spanning through different areas of the Mediterranean and not only, different time periods. So just going through quickly, we started with first section, more theory and methodology oriented, with the first contribution of Stefano on water management. And this is actually topics that kind of returned also in other contribution later in the conference. And of course, with an important accent also on methodologies and different techniques to record the development of the agricultural landscapes and water management. Then we had the contribution of Anna Leone, of course, on Libya, so completely different region, but of course she introduces also more consistently the problem of dealing with an endangered heritage in a war context. And of course, the problematics in reconstructing a bit the historically the landscape there, while not being able to go on the field, and of course the problem in monitoring also the damages, which more and more frequently involve the cultural heritage there. Then we had the contribution by Sauro Gelichi on Venice, and again, the dynamic relation between human communities and the environment was at the center of his presentation. And actually, especially being born in Venice, it was kind of interesting to see one of the really few archaeological evidence for the earliest phases of Venice and the management of landscape in the lagoon. And the first day ended with Michele Nucciotti's presentation on Florence. Well, it's a broader project, but where the University of Florence has a major role on cultural landscapes in Armenia, connected to the Silk Road. And I would say in his, I'm just trying to pinpoint a bit the elements, the topics which might also help us in going through the roundtable today. So what it really interesting to me in Michele's presentation was, of course, the importance culturally also today of landscapes. So the value that nowadays communities or nations give to landscape for different reasons, and which of course could also represent, and this is particularly true, he brought some examples in Armenia, for instance, where of course the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia also involved to a certain extent the cultural landscapes, which is at the very end in common between the two countries. But of course, the political and nationalistic developments put a huge threat, the cultural landscape. And of course, on a more research point, it was extremely interesting. And again, it's a common element also with our presentation, the dynamics between imperial powers, local communities, and of course the environment, which all together leads to the creation of a unique context, which is ultimately our interest when dealing with cultural landscapes. The second day was more oriented to the presentation of case studies, and also in this case, the attempt was to bridge a bit the experience in the archaeological research and historical research and aspects more related to cultural heritage management. We started with the contribution by Martin Sivantos on the study of irrigation systems, historical irrigation systems in Spain, in the area of Granada and Sierra Nevada. So it was extremely interesting, especially for their interest in engaging also today the local community in managing the historical irrigation systems, and of course all the explanation of how historically these irrigation systems were developed and managed too. So, but I found particularly interesting the aspect of the administration juridically of the water and access to water, which was entirely reliant on local communities. So the local communities controlled and administered their own irrigation system, and I found it extremely fascinating. The second contribution of the day by Anthony Quickle, who is here in presence, presented, I would say, a really interesting kind of project. So it's the Egypt Landscape Project has been conceived more as a opportunity to foster different research and to trigger the development of new future projects dealing with medieval Egyptian landscape. And of course, it's a brand new topic, especially for historian-oriented research. And so it was extremely interesting, and I'm really looking forward to see which are the future development, but the premises really look fantastic. After that, we had the contribution by Stephen McPhillips on Lebanon. And I would say it presented several topics which were already dealt in previous contributions. But I would say the most interesting thing about Stephen's presentation was the fact that the research area was already located into a national park. And of course, this brings in first attention, of course, the dimension of the valorization and the maintenance also of the environmental context, and not only of the archaeological remains. And of course, this is also a shared interest with Giorgia Cesaro's presentation on Petra, on the work that UNESCO conducted mainly in the SIC and in the areas of the site which are more directly connected with tourism, of course. But again, the bridge between research, which of course UNESCO didn't conduct in first person, but of course encouraged the valorization and protection also of the environment and of the cultural heritage, and the engagement of the local communities has been three major points in the presentation. The first section, also yesterday, was focusing primarily exactly on this aspect of the valorization and the preservation of cultural heritage in general, with specific references on cultural landscapes. So we had the presentation by Dario Scarpati, who's here, who to a certain extent presented a similar case study to the Lebanon one. So again, a national park where a huge effort in triggering I would say a bottom-up approach to the valorization of the cultural landscape has been implemented with the creation of the Eco Museum of the Madonie. And later, so the second presentation of the section was by Federica Maietti, who presented, I would say, an update overview of different projects dealing with the digitalization of cultural heritage, especially related to post-traumatic, I would say, events or rehabilitation of cultural heritage. Of course, building on the experience of the earthquake that hit the Emilia-Romagna in a few years ago, and with the development of different platforms to also make available to the broader community the data that have been gathered during the surveys and also the restorations of the structures involved. The day was closed by Munir Bushinaki, advisor to UNESCO, and with a long career in the, let's say, in the cultural heritage management, who presented, I would say, an extremely interesting case study from Algeria, which was one of the, I would say, one of the first attempts to really develop a national park into a UNESCO site has cultural landscape. And what struck me in particular was how early this attempt was conducted. So he mentioned that the site was inscribed in 1978, and of course with development of the conventions and everything so on, it changed a bit the approach, at least on an administrative level, but nonetheless it really was one of the first attempts to put a clear safeguard and put into practice a clear strategy to not only conserve and protect the amazing remains, prehistorical remains of rock art, but also the entire environment they were in. So after this long introduction, I would say I would welcome the three speakers of today. So we'll have a roundtable discussing few of the topics I just mentioned here and there. Of course, Monica Luengo from ICOMOS from Spain. Thank you very much for being here. Maya Cominco from ALIF Foundation. And Victor Brunfo de l'Université libre de Bruxelles. So just please correct me if I'm not mistaken, just to be a bit more precise. Monica was former and is yet honorary member, former president and nowadays honorary member of the International Scientific Committee on Cultural Landscapes for ICOMOS. Maya Cominco is the Scientific and Programs Director of ALIF Foundation, and Victor is, of course, a Professor of Architecture here, and also responsible of Habité, yes. Is a Center of Research on Development and Landscape and Paysage, so Développement, Territoire et Paysage, okay, at the ULB. What I would like to trigger is really an informal discussion. So as I mentioned, there are some elements which came through and are kind of recurring throughout the entire conference. And of course, one of the aspects that, especially in the second day, came up quite importantly is I would say the contrast between the different levels on which we work. So, of course, the research presents some difficulties, which are not only related to, of course, the difficulty in reconstructing the history of a landscape, but also from practical situation like environmental difficulties, which are not necessarily connected to climate change, but of course, also from the morphology of a site, which also determine the use or not of certain technologies, and of course, as in the case of Anna Leone, the impossibility of being on the field. So what I would like to ask you is, first of all, if you can just present in few words your experience related to specifically cultural heritage and cultural landscape. So if you are at the moment directly involved in some project on the field, and of course, if there is something you can tell us about eventually the difficulties in putting forward some valorization or protection plans. So I don't know, Monica, you want to start over?
If you want. Well, hello everybody, and thank you very much, Nicola, for this invitation. It's always a pleasure to share experiences with other people dedicated to cultural landscapes and to preservation of cultural heritage. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Well, I think that what you've mentioned, all the difficulties that we may face regarding conservation of this cultural heritage and conservation and management, means that before you have to assess values, and to assess values, first you have to know about the place. And so it's like going back, but all the main difficulties, I think, stem from the transversality of cultural landscapes. I mean, this link or this interplay or this relation or whatever you may want to call it with culture and nature, and of it being evolving also. Time is another very important factor. We are not speaking about built monuments that of course suffer a process, but it's not, how do you say, inherent
Yes.
to their essence, no, the process. So we are dealing with culture and nature, we are dealing with history and geography, simplifying, and that makes it so transversal that if you have to face the management of any cultural landscape, you cannot speak about one person or one administration, or no, you have to coordinate, usually environmental administration or ministries, cultural affairs, even agriculture, so politics, so and so on, no? So it's then you realize you are not, you have to deal with some ethical issues, because also there's a community that has lived or that's living there, and that is part of that cultural landscape, and the cultural landscape is part of their identity. I think that's probably Maja. Is it correct? That's that pronunciation of your name?
It's Maya, but Maja sounds very charming. So yes.
So Maya, I think that precisely the attacks or the impacts on cultural landscapes in armed conflicts, and you know better, much better than me, are directed to destroy or to damage the identity of the communities, no, that live there. So we are dealing then, when we speak of cultural landscapes, of culture, nature, history, geography, identity, communities. So that transversality is what makes very difficult and very challenging the management of cultural landscapes. Even more when we are now in a state, no, in a global state of huge impacts and risks with armed conflicts, with climate change, with industrial challenges, with even renewable energies. That's one of the solutions for the future, but on the other hand, it also has a huge impact on the cultural landscapes when we are dealing with pollution, when we are dealing with migrations. That also means migration of values, values that are reflected in the cultural landscapes, with development pressures. So it's a very, very challenging moment for the management of cultural landscapes. And well, I wouldn't be able as to define what are the main issues and the main solutions, because I don't think there's a magic recipe. Each case has to be studied because it has very, very different aspects. But the main essence of the problem is, for me, the transversality, not the mixture, the link of this culture, nature, humans, ecology, this biocultural diversity, or this culture-nature link.
Yeah, connected to that, if I may add just few numbers. So of course this is not the only possibility to protect or valorize and manage sites, but going through the UNESCO list, World Heritage list, I was struck by the fact that on more than 1,100 properties inscribed in the list, spread around 167 countries, only 120 more or less are officially inscribed as cultural landscapes, and of those only 10 are mixed properties, so combining cultural and natural, inscribed as both natural and cultural properties. And to those 119, to be precise, there are 39 other properties which are entirely mixed properties. And let's say the ratio in the tentative list, so the properties which are wanting to enter the list, is even more striking. So on over 1,700 applications, only 220 are actually regarding cultural landscapes. So what you just said about the difficulty probably to really tackle also on a management level the complexity of cultural landscapes is probably one of the reasons why I would say they are most at risk than other kind of cultural heritage, but still probably are more difficult to really defend in a more systematic way, I would say, because of the specificities they have, the complexity they have. So yeah, it was just to add.
Absolutely. Well, first we have to remember that cultural landscapes are only in the World Heritage List since 1992, so it's quite recent, no? And then we must also remember that a management system and an adequate protection are two of the pillars for an inscription in the World Heritage List. And it's not very easy to have a good management plan or an adequate management plan for properties that sometimes are huge in scale and include all kinds of archaeological remains, even towns or cities, different communities, very complex ecological systems, very complex agricultural systems. So they have a bit of everything. And of course, they have a very important area regarding intangible heritage. Mm-hmm. So this is quite difficult to manage and to organize. And so on one hand, it has been, this cultural landscape typology has been very useful in World Heritage nominations, because, you know, when we don't know very well what it is, we say it's a cultural landscape and that's it. No, it's a mix of everything. And well, no, we are not going to have another historic center in Europe inscribed never. Well, we'll say it's a cultural landscape somehow, no? So this has been like a kind of very useful typology, but on the other hand, very difficult, because you have from the sacred mountains or the sacred groves in Osogbo in Nigeria to the Orkhon Valley in Mongolia. You can imagine, well, that's relatively easy to manage, no? But if you have the Dresden Valley or the Rhine Valley, then or huge areas in Canada with First Nations people, that gets it's a bit complicated. So indeed, I think they are not easy to be inscribed, because not even us, I'm a NICOMOS member, and I've been evaluator. I've done technical evaluation, technical missions. I've been in the panel, and sometimes it's not easy at all to understand if that's a cultural landscape or not. I'll put before, for example, the example of Fray Bentos in Uruguay. Fray Bentos was an old, how do you say, meat, it's meat packaging or meat, where they did corned beef.
Ah, okay.
How do you say that? Well, it was an industry, you know, yes. Industry where they did corned beef. So, but it was the whole of the place, was the approach to the ships, the cattle, where they were kept. It was a big area, industrial area. So there was a discussion, no? Because it was not only the industrial buildings, but the whole complex and the approach by the sea. And so it was decided that it was an industrial cultural landscape. So you see how very different things you may use the same terminology, cultural landscape. No, it's so wide and so huge. It includes so many things that that's one of the first, I think, difficulties, no, to really understand what's a cultural landscape. We call cultural landscapes so many things. For example, the root of the, how do you say, incense in the Negev in Israel. Yeah. So you have a whole series of when you have an agricultural landscape, it's so easy. We are all very happy not to evaluate that because it's simple. But the rest of it, it's and for example, I've noticed that you've been talking very much about archaeological cultural landscapes, no?
Yeah.
That's really another challenge. No? So. Mm-hmm.
No, we'll probably have the opportunity to develop this topic later. So, Maya, would you offer your?
So I think that, thank you so very much, Monica. This is very interesting, and it's always good to have these discussions because our ALIF experience is very much limited to conflict and post-conflict areas, and we really do not so much focus on the normative definitions of cultural landscape as basically trying to integrate the context of the site really also in terms of landscapes, but we see it more and more happening. There seems to be a shift in places where we work, and we mostly work in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Mali, But what is very striking is that there's a growing consciousness of the sites needing to tell a story, and the story being told through the spatial relationships with the landscape and with other sites. So, for example, there is now an ongoing nomination between Iraq and Saudi Arabia of the series of sites on the route to Mecca, which does include landscapes around the sites, not just sites. Because I think that this, to me, aside of course the preservation of natural value of these sites, is really contextualizing, because one thing that we have learned from our work in places where there is the conflict often causes a level of detachment of communities from heritage, or maybe not all heritage, but the perception that some heritage is theirs, some heritage is the heritage of the other, and some heritage they detach from to the extent that they no longer can tell its story. And I don't know if you let me show one slide. This is not a slide that we. Let me just try to figure out if I can actually.
Let me make you co-host.
I think I can share the screen. I promise I won't. Oh no.
Okay.
There is this.
Well, now you should be able. Now you should be able.
Okay. Now I need to. It seems to be very. Forgive me. As I will be talking as I'm trying to work it out. There we go. I have it. I don't know if you can see this.
Yes, we can see it.
So I mean, I'm not going to go into any details, but perhaps these are a number of sites which I thought we could use as a case study. But here is a site where we actually don't work. Don't work yet. Who knows?
Can you launch the PowerPoint? Otherwise, we see.
Yes. How do I do this? Sorry.
It's the icon at the bottom.
Sorry, Anna. I usually use
that one.
Yeah, that one.
This one.
No. Go to the end of the line towards right. Yeah, there. Yeah, that one. Perfect.
Sorry. I usually use Apple, and PC confuses me. But this is an interesting case, I think, for our discussion. It's Ahmadi, it's in Iraqi Kurdistan, and it's a phenomenal site. It's a fortress that was inhabited since at least Bronze Age, but the fortress itself was built in the 11th century, and then it was the site of the longest existing Kurdish emirate. But basically, there are quite a lot of Parthian remains, there are medieval remains, and all sits in a landscape. But everything is very separated, and so far there is a push from the municipality and from the Kurdish Antiquities Service to preserve heritage sites in the city, and they're really fascinating. There are Jewish sites, there are Islamic sites, there are a few churches. But there is very little in terms of preserving landscape around it, and the city and its landscape as a whole. So, for example, on this photo on the right, you see what is a medieval, it's a 12th century Kubahan madrasa, which sits it's a stunning place. It sits in a valley below the city, and should absolutely be preserved with the landscape around it. It is it's a very contemplative, quiet place, which attracts a lot of, which has been attracting quite a lot of tourism. But the idea is, in places like this, that if you preserve the heritage, you preserve it. It does have to bring some monetary benefit, some financial benefits to the city. So the city, and in a sense we can understand this, but this makes it very difficult, because there's no appreciation that this should be preserved in its whole context. One of the things that the city is planning is a series of restaurants and parking lots next to madrasa when it is preserved. There is a Columbia University project with the Bagdinan Gate, which is the 12th century gate you see in the left corner. It's a gate built in the 12th century, but the road leading to the gate is Parthian, and you can just about see on the left on the wall Parthian reliefs on this wall. This is also called Mosul Gate because this road leads to Mosul ultimately. But again, we in the Columbia University team who works on the site told us that instead of preserving the whole of the landscape going to the valley, the city sees this monument, not the whole of its context, but just the monument as something that people will come to see it. And therefore they were also at some point planning a series of parkings to make it easier for tourists to visit. So I think that there is a lot what we are trying to do, without going into normativity of it or any legalities. We are trying to convince people that we work with, or people who ask us to work with them and consult with them, that they need to tell a story not only of a series of monuments, but the story of the entire city and what surrounds it, because otherwise it becomes so chopped up that it's almost incomprehensible even for the tourists that might visit the site. But in all honesty, of all the sites that we work at, this is an easy site. This is a site where it's a relatively peaceful area, although there has been some Turkish shelling in the mountains around where PKK is still active. But the city itself hasn't really suffered that much from the conflict. This is very unusual for us because normally we work in places like this, which is the minaret of Jam, where there is no danger of the landscape being destroyed for a moment, simply because it's all mined and no one is going to it's a paradox of the situation. But there are, as you know, in Afghanistan, the humanitarian situation is desperate. There is now a lot of investment coming from other Central Asian countries. There are very big industrial initiatives. How do you even argue in favor of preservation of cultural landscapes? We can just about be able to preserve cultural monuments. Perhaps this one is a little easier because this is a UNESCO site. There are some problems with delineation of the site, but should Turkmenistan or Uzbekistan decide to fund the pipe that goes through this site, I'm not really sure how much we're going to be able to do unless, and this is the same as in Amedi, we convince the local people that there is something about this landscape, there is of value to them and should be preserved to them. And if I can show you another site, this is a site that you all know, this is Mezainak. And this is yet another problem where preservation of cultural heritage is really reduced to preservation of sculptures, not even architecture really. I'm sure you know the story. There is a big copper mine, the second largest deposit in the world. There is a Chinese contract, but the reality of it is that the way to explore, the most economical and most way to explore this site is through open pit mining, which means that the site is going to be destroyed. And a very interesting discussion that has been happening for the last 20 years, if not more, is, can you just remove the sculptures? We will remove the sculptures and it will be fine. But of course, the sculptures, the small element that one could conceivably remove are not they are very important, but the major value of the site is its relationship. It's a whole city. It's a Buddhist city built on a copper mine and on a Silk Road in a relationship to landscape and to other cities on the Silk Road, to other Buddhist sites which abound in this area. And there is very little understanding of the potential for storytelling, although there has been a push from within Afghanistan to try to use this argument as something to perhaps protect the site and to do underground mining, which is not economically not so economically beneficial. But here again, there is if considering that this site is the value that Afghanistan is going to get from this site it exceeds the annual GDP. For I think 20 years, it's going to double the income of the whole country, and therefore save lives. It is a very difficult decision to make. And I'm sorry, I'm going to just stop here, but one of the interesting sides, because Niccolò asked us to speak a little bit about climate change. This is Dantegara, where we also work with UNESCO. I'm sure you all know it. It is a very interesting site. There are 30 villages on the site, but it poses a big problem in terms of preservation, because the site has been affected not only by conflict, but also by climate change, which makes the agriculture, which is a part of cultural value of this site, very difficult, simply because the climatic conditions have changed. So what do we do here? I mean, do we force these people to stay just because this is a cultural site? Do we help them to stay? And we make an intervention that, what sort of intervention do we carry out to make the agriculture and living on the site sustainable? So there are ways to do this, but it requires a lot of careful calibration and careful discussion. This project for us started only 2 years ago, and we have already had to change it several times, simply because here we're talking about human lives, and we simply cannot ask anyone to sacrifice their life and their opportunities to benefit from various economic possibilities elsewhere, simply because we want to preserve a living heritage site. So there is also this tension. If there is a cultural landscape with living heritage, to what point are we interventionists and we sort of try to encourage people to stay to the detriment of their own economic development, and to what extent do we just reconcile ourselves that there is a change coming and this site cannot be frozen in time? And I think this is all from me. Sorry, I probably talked too much. But
no, it's no problem. And of course, I take the chance seeing that Anna has a question. So if you want to just ask a question, go ahead. So it's really an open discussion. So just go ahead, Hannah.
So more than a question is a comment that I just want to say on this situation of populations who are living in specific villages, and whether we have to leave them there despite the difficulties of living in the place. I would like to say that in the Nafusa, where we are about to start, where we have done already some work, and we will continue now, thank you to Alif, we have seen, in fact, that especially during the Italian colonial period, a lot of these medieval villages were abandoned because this is a mountain area, it's very unfriendly. It was difficult to bring electricity and build roads. So people were obliged to move into more modern villages and abandoned the old villages that are now almost entirely disappearing because, of course, there is no maintenance of these villages. So there is really a medieval cultural landscape which is very rapidly disappearing. And the same is happening in the very south of Libya, in Fezzan, where the city of Germa, which was actually occupied from the 8th century BC, was occupied until 1920, when the Italian colonizers obliged the people to move out because the city was built in mud brick, and it was very difficult to kind of develop it into a modern city with electricity and everything. So the people were obliged to live in new concrete houses. And because it's mud brick and nobody's maintaining this city, is basically dissolving. And in 20 years, nothing will be left of this city. So this is a major issue. Do we favor convenience, or do we continue to maintain alive this cultural landscape? So it's one of the major problems I think that we are facing. I just wanted to say this.
No, thank you, and I totally agree. So this is probably one other topic we'll talk more in detail later. So the question of sustainability also of interventions eventually, and of course the problem that I think it was Georgia yesterday who mentioned that. So it's not only a problem of first intervention to protect or valorize something, but also the possibilities of keeping in place the actual actions that you encouraged or so. In this sense, maybe, so I don't want to fall into being naive, but if really there is an engagement, a direct engagement of local communities, possibly the possibilities of keeping in place certain types of actions is more possible. I wouldn't say more likely, but it's more possible. Yes. So, and some of the experience that also we shared in these few days maybe are a good example to put forward. But of course, it has been repeated over from you and from Monica, is that the specificities of each local case are so huge that it's really difficult to just put forward some universally valid solution or ideas. So, Victor, so what do you want to add to what?
No, I will react to this last comment on the abandoned villages with an experience I had probably 20 or 25 years ago, maybe a little more. I'm an architect, urban planner, and mostly professor these last years. And at that time, we went in Tunisia with a friend, professor from Italy, from the Politecnico di Milano. And we went into a small village, which had been abandoned by its population. It was a village, a Berber village near Sousse in the center of Tunisia. And it had been abandoned because of the lack of water, of course. And people would leave their houses and build new houses in the plains where there would be available tap water. And so it was what was interesting in that case is that we went there to do architectural survey of the ruins of the remains of the village, which was it's an absolutely fantastic village, of course, an amazing site on the top of a hill. And what's interesting is that the only family that remained there was the family of the saint, of the Marabout, who had to stay there because they had to take care of the Marabout, of the tomb of the saint, where people would come on pilgrimage. And this family, they hosted us for 1 month, and they took care of us, and it was so incredibly nice. And so probably that's a way of entering these things, is trying to find what can be the interest of people to stay there, and what are the values. And I haven't been back there. I don't know what happened later on. I sincerely hope that something has been done to preserve that village. But that idea of this family being there and of the dead actually taking care of the heritage and of the memory of the places is probably something which is interesting to think about. And so this link with the past and the link with the people that lived before is probably what makes it interesting and more than interesting. I completely agree with the fact that it's so complicated. As I said, I'm an architect, and I mainly work with students and doctorate PhD students as well, and trying to develop in the mind of these young future architects that nothing is easy, and that easy solutions are bad solutions, easy thinking is bad thinking, and that it's important to keep in mind that complexity. And what's interesting about complexity is that it's a way actually of preserving in many ways the qualities of context of sites. Of course, there are catastrophic decisions being made, but also the entanglement between population, local communities, political people trying to make decisions about their territories is what makes it also possible for us to work there and to work on the conservation. We have to work with the forces that are on the territory and not thinking that we can come from outside. We're always coming from outside these territories, but we're trying to grasp what's on the site and what are the projects of the people, the projections of the people. We as architects, we mainly work on transformation. And I believe that's probably I would say the main issue for me on this issue of cultural landscapes and stuff, is that we have to be careful not to freeze things, and we have to be hopeful in the abilities of the people living in a territory to actually do what they know. And we have to work together to see what can be done to keep, I would say, the structures. I think these cultural landscapes, territories or cultural landscapes are mainly, they're of course objects of transformations which can be terrible, but mainly the idea underneath is the idea of the longue durée, and of the fact that these territories are subjects of changes that you can always trace back in time, and that the actions that are taken nowadays are part of that historical transformation process. And we should not be scared of these processes either. Of course, I know there is conservation and there is a need to understand what's going on, and there is a need of probably a pedagogical need to create a link of a comprehension of that of those processes. But I think it goes through an understanding and probably a leap of faith with the people that live there. We're actually, I will just say a few words about a project we're dealing with in these 3 years. It's an Erasmus Plus project on the Mediterranean shore. And it's a project we were making with Venezia, the School of Architecture of Venezia, School of Architecture of Marseille, and the School of Architecture of Rabat in Morocco. And we're working on metropolitan territories of the Mediterranean shore that are facing climate change issues. So we're trying to see what's going on there and what can be done by architects and urban planners. And we've been working for now 2 years almost. First year we worked on Tétouan, the Tétouan shore, Tanger-Tétouan metropolitan area. which is of course filled with archaeological issues and agricultural issues and metropolitan transformation and all that. Still, the landscape is absolutely incredibly wonderful, and incredibly wonderful also because of the transformation process which is taking place there. This year we've been working on the Lagoon of Venice, so it's even more difficult, even more intricate between history and what's going on now, and also the issue of tourism is very important. And next year we will be working on Marseille. And what's interesting is that on this project we work with architecture students, of course, and on climate change issues, of course, how climate change will change and will need new tools, especially to be developed in architectural schools to tackle these issues. But also what's interesting in the project is that we work with an agency, a French agency, which is called AVITEM, Agence pour la Ville et les Territoires Méditerranéens, and they work with urban planners, with professionals of urban planning. And so we can do the link between school, teaching, research, and actual action and political action of management of these territories. And what's interesting is that nobody knows what to do. Nobody has answers. And the getting together of all these people to work and to think about what's going on based on students' proposals and students' drawings and stuff, it's so incredibly interesting for everybody to work on something which is real. And it's interesting, of course, for the students, but it's also interesting for these professionals, because professionals, they don't have time to look. They're just stuck into work. And I would go back to what Monica said about time. It's not about not only time, historical time, but it's also the time you take to make a study, to take time to just go deep into what you're doing. And that's probably, I would say that's the main issue for us as professionals of these fields, is to try to fight back for that time that we can spend on these issues and on working on what we're doing. We don't have time no more, and we need to fight back to find that time, I think. I don't know if that helps or happens.
No, and there are really some keywords I would pick from what you just said. So it's funny when you said the fear for transformation that is felt from architects. Well, we as archaeologists, well, I don't want to speak for the entire category, but sometimes some of us are afraid of change, meaning that once we dig a site or study a site, we pretend to have it like remain that. There's no transformation, no change. And what you said, so transformation over the longue durée, is actually one of the elements of the complexity also, just to bring back what Monica said. And it's the only way to keep alive something. So if you don't transform, if you don't adapt, maybe adaptation again with sustainability or so, it's really the key to allow the cultural heritage, cultural landscape specifically, to survive the inevitable, I would say, change, which from different forces, being the human, being the environmental, are going to take place in that specific context. Monica, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, it's also fascinating. I hope, Nicola, that you can and then perhaps share with us afterwards your emails, because I want to keep in contact. You are
Sure.
showing and speaking of some wonderful projects I would like to know more about, because unfortunately I could not follow your papers, so I'll be very grateful. And I would like to highlight two of the things you've said. No, one is about the community and living. I think it was Anna, well, and Maya. Maya was also speaking about them. No? We are all speaking about living, living landscapes, and living landscapes means communities. Communities who, I don't want to say who live in the landscape, no, because they are part of the landscape. It's not that the landscape is there and they are, no, it's landscape and themselves cannot be separated, no? So for that reason, I think that the only way to approach the management of these places is a right-based approach. If you don't involve, or if it's not all the stakeholders, the community living there who's involved in conservation, you'll never get to a good conservation of the place. This is difficult because you have to take in consideration all the stakeholders involved and make them to share a vision, because many times different stakeholders, they are all having their little perspective, no? So you have to make them agree in a vision for the place, that sometimes some of them or most of them have to accept some things that they at first they wouldn't. But it's the only way to make resilient landscapes and to keep on the living. And time, as Victor was saying, is exactly what he says. We must learn to manage change. This is what we are doing now. I don't know if you have, I think it's Heritage, English Heritage, who has some conserving principles that they say, what they call is management of change, exactly, no? So, and they speak very clearly about the different phases you have to do, no? It's I highly recommend that paper because it's very easy, although it's already like 10 years old, I think, with the main principles and the main guidelines. So you must first know about what values are you speaking, what is the cultural landscape, what are the values, is the agricultural system, the built, or is it everything, or is it the traditions that you have there, is it the religious values, or all of them together, no? And then examine how different changes are going to impact on those values, and then establish to what limit, no? Establish the limits of change. If you are able to establish, bueno, you establish limits, theoretically limits for that change, no? So, and then you must implement, no? Those actions or initiatives. The problem is that sometimes these initiatives need resources, let's say, because we are speaking about methodology and theory, but unfortunately, usually it's the lack of resources, no? That's because we could make very easy the places and the cultural landscapes for people if we had resources to make them to satisfy their needs. And I think there's something that we have not yet understood. There's not even in the, how do you say, developed countries. This is, we are many times, for example, paying for ecosystem services. The European Union, for example, gives a lot of funding and resources to, let's say, shepherds, because they are keeping some biodiversity. But they are never paid for their cultural services, because they are also keeping a landscape in a shape and a form with this, and they are keeping some special, how do you say, species of animals, for example, and they are keeping a certain way of traditions and intangible material and paths in the landscapes. But this is not understood yet. We only understand that, of course, maintaining ecology and natural values should be somehow funded, but not cultural aspects. Why? We need to, I think that in this culture nature, culture has been very, how do you say? Subestimado, underestimated, no? While ecology seems to be the solution for everything. And I think we have to go back and establish that we need to pay for some cultural services by these living communities, because they are keeping ways of life, cultural landscapes, traditions that we need as much as we need those endangered species or that kind of natural habitats, no? But this unfortunately takes time. And the problem is that the changes nowadays, currently, are going so quickly that I don't know if we will be able to shift our minds in time to achieve the preservation of many of those, not cultural landscapes only, but of those living communities, no, that are associated to those cultural landscapes, and who are the reason. Their well-being is really the reason for the preservation of those cultural landscapes.
And just to add two things, maybe time is, as you said, is change nowadays is faster and faster. It's taking place faster. And the other problem is that sometimes the problem in dealing with communities, especially if you, I don't want to use a too strong word, but if you overimpose a plan for a valorization or so, they pretend to have quick results. So the problem of the time that is needed to really have the transformation controlled and over the longue durée, sustainable, and so sometimes is really in tension with what the communities, local communities, sometimes see in the possible results of valorization plans and management plans. So probably the issue of time is double. So it works on different levels. Because on the one side, the change is really fast and taking place also more frequently, not only faster, but it's also more frequent. And on the other side, the results, which probably in function of these constantly faster and more frequent change, are expected by the local communities in terms of possibilities or also, yes, as you said, resources that might be brought by these plans. And I don't know, Maya, do you, for instance, this is something you mentioned earlier, talking about the mining in, was it in Afghanistan, right? Or and also in Kurdistan, the other side. So the problem when dealing with these topics, not only cultural landscapes but also cultural heritage, is this conflict between economic advantages, which are might lead to urban development, uncontrolled urban development, or exploitation of resources, and then the cultural heritage aspect. So what you said now, Monica, is about the services, the ecosystem services, the cultural services, which really should be paid or encouraged. So the problem, I think, is really make the communities probably feel that maintaining their own or offering cultural services can pay off. Of course, not as much as opening a mine in the second largest resource in the world, but still, maybe in the long term, it's more valuable than the immediate economic. I don't know. I don't want to sound naive, but what you think about? So this is, I think, one of the major problems when dealing with valorization of cultural heritage in general.
But, you know, I think that there is, I think there always has to be, give or take, we are not going to be able to preserve every single cultural landscape.
Sure.
We don't do this in Europe. We're not going to, you know, and it's, I think that what sometimes is very frustrating is that there is a perception that the sites in places like Afghanistan or Iraq, they should be preserved as they are because they sort of, you know, they outside developing world. So they, you know, is a little bit of playground for Europeans, for European tourists, European archaeologists. It's not. It's, you know, it has every right to develop as much as Europe, as America. But I think that, you know, there is opportunity in every crisis, and the fact that there is a need for development, and engagement in discussion and trying to find a middle ground. You know, in some cases it's going to be very difficult. Messainak certainly, especially now with the new power in Afghanistan. But I think that we perhaps cannot save 100% of what we would really like to save. But there is, because saving of this landscape does have benefits, as everyone said. It's really, it's just finding a way to give concessions on both sides and try to find a way of doing them, of doing the preservation of the sites in a way that it really is aligned with the interests of local people. Rather than you know, so and really engaging in this discussion, because this is what we see is often a little bit lacking, trying to explain, you know, and it's maybe not even explain, but just trying to demonstrate that it's not the development and preservation of the site and the landscapes is that these are not two contradictory. They are not contradictory. And for example, UNESCO has done absolutely brilliant work in Bamiyan on this. So the seeds have been planted, and I think it's just, you know, it's building around these cases where such preservation has been successful. That will develop a dialogue that we all need to participate in, not only people in Afghanistan and Iraq, but also, as Monica was saying, also people in Europe, because there where the development is advancing really fast, these are the most difficult cases, really. I mean, paradoxically, sometimes the war, you know, as in cases where sites are, but territory is full of mines. I mean, you know, it's not, you know, it's no one is going to touch it just for simple reason that it's too dangerous. So there are these paradoxes, and there's no one size fits all. But I think that managing the change is exactly the way we should approach it, because these always have been a living landscapes. So we, you know, if we freeze them in time, this, in a sense, we take the biggest value, which is the value of being a living landscape.
Maya, sorry to interrupt, but if you are interested in this debate with mining and development, there was a very interesting place nomination for World Heritage Site, that's Rosia Montana in Romania. You know well.
I know it well because
when the political party changed, then it was again presented, again retired, and was finally inscribed. But there has been lots of debate in the local community if they are interested in the inscription, or they simply prefer the mining activity to come back again. So it's not easy at all.
You wanted to say something earlier?
Yeah, I wanted to react to that idea of funding cultural protection by people. I'm not sure it's a good idea, actually. I believe that, for example, ecological protection is part of cultural protection, of course. And probably pinpointing this dimension of preservation as a cultural role of someone could be more damaging than actually could save things, I would say, because I think that it's what's important is to realize that culture is, I mean, it's everything, of course. Of course, we know it's important to keep culture and to make culture first, of course, but it's actually, culture is like the way we put everything together, the way we as people, as inhabitants, as community, how do we manage living with a territory? And which brings me also to a discussion, which is a current discussion, conceptual discussion about that distinction between nature and culture, which has been discussed for the last 30 years or even more. But that discussion is very important, actually, and especially when we talk about these things, to realize that it's not as neutral as it can seem. It's absolutely fundamental to understand that there is a link between ecological and cultural attitudes or comportments, behaviors of people. And so what's important is to bring back attachment and to bring back a sense of thinking about things and not thinking that it's very clear and it's easy. And that's what's interesting is to go deep into the questions, into the issues, I would say, and not only with local communities, but with political bodies, with institutional bodies. I don't know, I was in an Erasmus meeting a few days ago with people from UNESCO as well. And I mean, the institutional language is so completely away from anything which is real that it becomes a complete other framework to look at things, which is completely abstract. And I believe we need to be very much into sites and complexity and all that. That's, yeah. No,
I totally agree. And again, complexity is probably the keywords of this roundtable. So probably recognize, so the importance of recognizing the complexity in general, not only of cultural landscapes, is the key also to really identify the questions which are, and to prioritize different kind of questions when we are dealing with any kind of heritage. Because of course we are talking primarily, we mentioned also with the case studies or so, a real material dimension of cultural landscapes. So the remains, the archaeological evidence, the ecological context, but then as was mentioned also by Monica, there's all the intangible side of the thing, and of course the questions which we need to identify and to answer are different. So if we don't recognize the complexity of the whole, it's impossible to do it. And as you said at the very beginning, I really like it, and I totally agree. There is no simple answer if the object we are dealing with is complex. So it cannot go together. So no, it's I think it's really the key. And to a certain extent, what I really liked, and it was really the occasion that led to this conference, is that what I liked of all the contribution we had today, from an archaeological point of view, they really managed to show the complexity of the landscape. And in this sense, again, I don't want to sound naive, but I think that bridging, really connecting the two aspects, which sometimes works a bit on two different levels. So also our understanding of landscape might differ, but the complexity that the recent archaeological investigation highlighted in the past might help to understand or eventually recognize the complexity of today, and possibly by merging the two complexities, we'll find something useful for the future. I don't know if it sounds naive or stupid, but that was one of the goals for this conference. So bringing together two fields which possibly analyze or try to answer similar questions applied to different objects, but which I'm really convinced needs to talk more directly, cooperate more directly, and possibly collaborate, really. Not only in terms of, okay, let's identify a site which has a historical interest, let's apply for the UNESCO list and whatever, and so on and so forth. We really need to build together a discourse aware of the specificities of each case studies and so on, but try to really build together a way to disentangle the different complexities. I don't know if this makes sense, if you have something to add, or in general, also from the other participants, have thoughts on these. Oh yes, please.
I just wanted to say my experience is entirely within the Egyptian landscape, right? So it's.
Do you want to come here maybe, or because I don't know? Can you hear him well, or?
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect.
And the Egyptian circumstance is so unique in that 99% of the population lives on 1% of the land, and so you have these it's a highly densely populated landscape in a sense, and so. And for all of Egyptian history, more or less, this has been the case. So all of the kind of, beyond the natural landscape, but all of the kind of cultural, historical landscape is on top of each other, all of it. And so you get this situation that you can't turn over a rock without finding something historic or important culturally or archaeologically. And it's led to this point where now that there is rapid development, there's a major pushback. There's these competing factions, and I think this goes to the heart of some of the things we've talked about today, where you have the conservationists, the UNESCO people, the academics, the archaeologists trying to conserve and protect, and you have the population saying, why don't we have a right to development like everybody else does? And what I think is very interesting, and this is kind of my point about what we've talked about today, is that there was a big debate, I think in maybe February of this year, in the media and on Twitter, where Egyptians were saying, our heritage is our curse. And it's gotten to the point where, because there's a sense that we can't do anything, we can't build a bridge, we can't build a highway, we can't build any of these things without destroying something, that the heritage now feels like the impediment to development. And it's magnified in Egypt, perhaps in ways that it isn't in other places. And as a result, I think there's a real risk of the community, of the people that care about heritage, alienating themselves to a point where the population no longer cares about heritage. And I think we're kind of getting to that kind of threshold right now. I mean, I can give you two examples. There's a road being built through a historic cemetery in the city. The cemetery is now in the middle of the city because the city kind of enveloped it in the 50s and 60s, but now it's in the center of the city. They're building a highway through it. And the part where they're building the highway has mostly burials from the 40s, 50s, and 60s. There's very little from preceding periods to be protected. And so the conservationists say, you know, these tombs are built in an important modernist style from this period. So then the government proposed moving the highway slightly, and the people that were from the medieval period, the Mamluks said, well, now the vibrations from the cars are going to disrupt these Mamluk tombs. And so then at a certain point, there was no wiggle room for negotiation, so the government just bulldozed through the area because neither of the plans satisfied anyone. In the west of the city, near the Giza Plateau, the government finally, after 30 or 40 years, has completed the ring road around the city, but that meant that the road is in the desert landscape near the pyramids, so it disrupts these kind of like these views of the pyramids on the edge of the desert. And again, you know, it has dramatically lower traffic, it's dramatically changed the ability of people to move around the city. But you know, the conservationists, especially UNESCO in this case, push back very heavily. And so now this is really what is triggering these debates. And I don't know, I feel very frustrated as somebody who cares about heritage watching this, because now it's kind of become black and white. Either you care about heritage, which means you want to protect 100% of everything, or you don't care at all and you see heritage as an impediment. And this has become really, I mean, it's really sad when Egyptians, who are the inheritors of one of the wealthiest legacies of world heritage, are now seeing their own heritage as a curse to their future and their development. And I think that's one of the risks where we are in this debate.
Well, I think there are possibly two problems here on the two sides of the trenches, I would say. So on the one side is the problem of the education, probably, and the other is the abstract language that sometimes we as people engaged in cultural studies and so on sometimes keeps. So probably one of the reasons why we end up being in this sort of situation is that there's no middle ground or overlap between the two sides. And yeah, I think it is frustrating, and to a certain extent, well, also we in Italy, we have sometimes the same issue. So in countries where the density of cultural heritage is so high, it is sometimes frustrating saying, okay, well, why I cannot live like these other people in a developed country or so, because you know, every possible improvement is stopped by the archaeologists or UNESCO experts or whatever. So of course it's finding a compromise is it.
In Italy, you described the great city. I work in the inner part of the mountains in the province of Palermo. We have not this kind of problem. Victor described my work. How much time I spend in Madonie. This time, today now, I'm in the Madonie because I'm working in the tram, in the bus. We have to connect every person, every institution, every association, every peasant, every farmer together, because we have to ask to them, do you want to live there, here? Well, how, not why, but how you want to live there. And so I make a work, I don't know in English, as facilitatore museale. I have to, my work is to make the connection between person and heritage and immaterial heritage and territory. But I have to do this, I can do this because I'm not a Madonite, but I spend my life in Madonie. I'm in the city and out of the city. And so I allow myself to speak with others, which with the other person, but I'm recognized as an outsider. I'm trying to explain my work, and of course, it's not easy, but it's wonderful.
Giorgia, please go ahead.
Yes, hi.
Oh, we can also see you today.
Yes, yes. I'm sorry again for yesterday. Actually, I was at my place at home today. I'm not. I'm following the conference while doing some, some other engagements. But I was very interested in the conversation and the discussion, and I wanted to say something from a UNESCO perspective, since this has come up quite frequently, and also because of my experience here in Jordan, working at Petra as a World Heritage Site, which is definitely a complex World Heritage Site. So it's about complexity and also about finding a balance between development and preservation of the site. So this is something I've been working on for several years. And yesterday I brought my my experience in terms of management of a landscape and what UNESCO is doing to integrate both the intangible component with the tangible and the community, how to involve the community in the management. So I just wanted to emphasize and to echo what also the other participants have been discussing today, because I really think that the key is the community involvement. I've been saying this yesterday. It might be something that you read in books, but it's true. And I wanted to take as example the development of the integrated management plan for Petra. Is a process that we have been actually, let's say, promoting, but in fact not completely leading. So it was the local authorities and the Department of Antiquities of Jordan leading it through our guidance. And as part of the process, as you might be aware, but for Petra, there were already 3 management plans developed, but never really implemented and never endorsed by the government. And there was probably a reason. It was because experts had come together to work on the plans. The first was in 68, so very long ago. But secondly, UNESCO had worked in 1994, and then ICOMOS 1999, and none of them had been really endorsed. And why? And the National Park Services, sorry, had come back again in 2000 with a big project. In fact, the community at large, the stakeholders that coming from the local community had not been involved that much. And so what we have been implementing has been a 4-year project that brought together more than 100 people, divided into forums. So there were forum group meetings addressing and targeting different topics, from urban planning to heritage conservation, nature conservation, or infrastructure development. And the people who were chairing the committees were actually either from the academia or from the authorities, from the Petra Development Tourism Regional Authority, from the Department of Antiquities. And they were leading it through our guidance. And we started exactly by understanding what were the values for the communities, and what were the challenges for each of these topics. And then we went into discussing how to address these challenges, how to protect these values, and to pass the message that the protection, the preservation of the site is key. And doing these meetings that did not happen very frequently, was every 3-4 months, gave the possibility to the participants to reflect on all these issues and come back to the meeting with ideas. And eventually the plan was endorsed in 2019, and it was the first plan for Petra to be endorsed, and the Petra Park is actually following it, although of course they have an interest in development, and this is very much evident if you will go to Petra now. Tourism is a top priority, but it was clearly a capacity building experience that really paid off for the authorities. So just I wanted to bring this example and to say that it might be working, and the approach that we followed is taken from the urban planning board, where consultation and participation is key, is crucial to come up with proposals, ideas that are shared by the community. So just this, and sorry again for the setup. I'm not at home in this moment.
Don't worry. And thank you. Yes, as you partially already presented yesterday, it is a good example of tension between development and local stakeholders, and so. And also, well, I was recently in Petra, and it doesn't go without further tensions, I would say, especially when authorities and local are on opposite viewpoints or perspectives on certain aspects of the management of the site, let's say so. Yeah.
Just because thinking about talking about these issues going forward, and kind of in response to the discussion about stakeholders, community stakeholders of Petra and this sort of thing, is that a lot of the case studies yesterday and today have been about fairly rural sites. I mean, Petra, I know that there is a local population, but we're still talking about tens of thousands of people. When I mentioned the Egyptian example, we said about how Italy is highly populated and also has these long periods of heritage as well. But Rome is a city of 2.83 million people. Cairo, the greater city, is 20 million. So perhaps in terms of thinking about how do you preserve sites in highly urbanized, highly dense populated areas, and thinking about how do you involve stakeholders in those situations, going forward, it might be interesting to look at case studies from India or China, places that have long periods of heritage development, heritage over the longue durée, millennia, alongside highly dense urban populations and highly populated areas. Our case studies today and yesterday have been mostly from the Mediterranean world, and the most Arab countries that we've looked at also are not as highly densely populated, but maybe the Cairo example matches more of a Mexico City, a New Delhi, a Beijing model, where you also have all of these layers. And maybe that's something, because you also have these cultural and historical landscapes, but they're in a very different context than Petra. In Cairo itself, in neighborhoods, when they do projects, they do bring in local stakeholders from the neighborhood. But a neighborhood might have a population of 100,000, and that's one neighborhood. And so that would be that's a small scale city in many other parts of the world when they talk about local community input or whatever you're talking. In my own city in Germany, where I'm doing my work, the population is 40,000, and they have already major community stakeholder discussions on heritage, and that's 40,000. That's not even half of a neighborhood in Cairo. Yeah. And so really, when you think about stakeholders, you have to think about scale, I think. And I think also looking at successful models maybe that have been done in much more urbanized areas as well, in terms of cultural management and the way that neighborhoods have transformed things, that might be useful going forward, looking at those kind of examples and case studies as well.
But I think this is also something that Monica mentioned earlier. So we really need to think in terms of specific case studies. And of course, well, if I'm not mistaken, there is a conventional, no, it's not a convention, it's like a guideline, a series of guidelines on urban, historical urban landscapes. So this is something that is really, I would say, I don't want to say that is following another path, but is something that is dealt with at least on a higher level in a different way or from a different perspective rather than the cultural landscapes, I would say. But of course, again, it's recognizing the specificities of each case study and the complexity of each study. So the Madonie won't have the same set of issues like Libya or Cairo, but of course, we need to understand which are the forces at game in that specific context, and which is also the threats eventually, which are the actors which are involved in that specific context. So yes, of course, what you say is true, but I think it falls under the recognizing the specificities of each case studies, of course. And I believe that also, like in Mexico City, despite the size, more similar size with Cairo, then due to environmental differences, we'll have different sets of difficulties which go beyond probably the density of population or so. So again, it's really difficult to I think, set a universally valid discussion. What might be interesting to really set a series of guidelines to recognize how to recognize complexity, I would say, how to proceed if it's possible at all, but or what we should look at least to where we should look at to recognize complexity. Stefano, sorry, you had a comment, question?
Yeah, just I mean, some comments, and let's say, I mean, it was also interesting, I mean, to get this, I mean, the last comments, because I would say that, of course, I mean, there is specificity depending from case studies, from different situation, issue of scale, issue of different context and environment and circumstance. But what I found interesting is that there are, I mean, you talk about mainly, I would say, for instance, Iraq, Libya, Jordan, the MENA region, generally speaking. But what I found that most of the issue that has been raised could, I mean, be shared also, I mean, from, let's say, Italy, Europe, and, I mean, most of the countries. I'm thinking about, for instance, what you said about local people. Engaging local people in archaeology, in cultural landscapes, explaining them and talking with them, and the value of the landscapes, I think, is let's say, is an issue and is an effort that we have to do also in, I mean, also in Italy as well as in the other countries. What is also needed in Italy as well as in other places is a political action. And what you said about fundings, of course, I mean, more money are needed, but sometimes the problem is the continuity in getting fundings, because I mean, if you get a relatively high budget for a few years, of course, I mean, it doesn't work, it's not enough. Another problem that has been partially touched, I would say, but that I think is extremely important is, I mean, preserving what? What do we have to preserve? And if the answer is everything, I would say that the answer is wrong. We can preserve everything. So, and we need also to, let's say, to discuss, and I mean, to start a discussion. It's already running, but in any case, to continue discussing on how to make choices and what we have to preserve, because preserving everything is absolutely impossible. Yeah, I mean, that's it. I don't have any further I mean, comment to the discussion, but I think that I found very interesting to realize again within this discussion that there are lots of problems and issues that are absolutely shared by any kind of cultural landscape.
And I think this conference really offered, despite the differences between each case study, there is a common thread that is just running across all the contribution, and that's why I'm particularly glad that all of you participated. Really, so I think it was a good opportunity also to compare different experiences. And what you just said, Stefano, I totally agree. So it is impossible, and sometimes we as archaeologists, we fall into that we pretend to just what I was saying earlier. So we have a site and we want to keep it like it was at the ancient time or so, no transformation, no change, freeze everything at that specific point. What you say, valorizing and protecting everything is impossible, and I think it's also important to not only identify what is really needed to be preserved and valorized, but also, again, the time dimension, prioritize different interventions where needed and at the time they are needed. So again, I think time is also another key word that we'll bring from this discussion. Okay, yes, thank you for sharing the documents. Perfect. Okay, it is in the chat. So we are almost, I would say, get to the end of the roundtable. We really had a huge discussion. We brought some huge topics that, of course, are a center of larger debate that extends beyond this conference, of course. Is there any other question, remark, comment, just final comments or so? Otherwise, well, just a reminder, the intention is to publish the proceedings of this conference. So we'll definitely keep in touch also after the end of today's session. I won't forget to, so the website needs to be updated. So the website that is online through the CREA, so the local department, but I'll take care of having all the contacts uploaded there. So if you want to get in touch with other speakers or so, you'll have the information there. In any case, I can also easily send a PDF with all the contacts per email to you in the next coming days. And if anybody else has something to say, I would thank you, all of you, very much to have joined this really interesting conversation and discussion. I think we'll leave with a lot of questions, which is, I think, the best way to proceed. I like when there are more questions than answers. So this is, I don't know, it's some. And no, thank you very much again. I really hope we'll be able to have another opportunity to meet, maybe in person. And no, let's keep in touch, definitely. And I'll come back to you soon with further information for the publication of the proceedings. So thank you again for participating.